So the next speaker is Mina Islar from Lund University in Sweden. Welcome, Mina.
Hi, everyone. Now I'm going to share my work. Right. Do you see it? And I'm going to make it, of course, in a presentation now. And thank you, Ashim. I think your presentation will kind of connect to mine quite well as I... Wait a minute. Yes. Do you see it now?
Yes.
All right. That I will use the social science approach to discussing also glaciers' contributions to people. And here in this research that I'm leading with a couple of people also in both in Lund University and Copenhagen University, we are interested in introducing social science to these debates.
Mina, can you remove that box?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yes. Sorry. And this one, no. So we are looking at social science studies now in order to understand what is loss in this glacier loss from a societal perspective as well. Because most often we see the climate change science and have a global gaze that we tend to measure impacts from above through modeling and remote sense models, focusing on the scale of ice being disappeared. So here the acknowledgement, of course, from social sciences is that glaciers affect society and culture. Ashim already showed a little bit about hydropower and some of the infrastructures that can be affected, also glacier-related hazards. Here we also want to also expand this type of research to other type of livelihoods when it comes to cultural, tourism, recreational uses, but also understand how people's access and control over land can change in relation to also the values that they put for glaciers and the way they attribute meaning to glaciers. We're working on this analytical framework where we're trying to introduce social science approaches to and ecosystem services approaches to climate change policy sphere. So now I'm not going to go into this, but it kind of combines both theoretical frameworks from political ecology, which means the way that societies are designed can also be based on power relations. And we use ecosystems valuation methods in relation to ecological economics background and try to integrate these modeling and mapping researchers in relation to policy making and bringing basically future perspectives and connecting to the present. And we want to bring the attention to inequalities that might happen through and does happen through glacier retreat in the context of climate change. When these areas especially is very much governed by development policies, there are changing relations and the societies are not equal. They have different rural subjectivities depending on the livelihoods they have. So I'm not going into all the theories, but one of this hydrosocial perspective argues that water flows to power. So water flows are very much determined with the technologies that can be offered to a society, but also the structures that is based on, for instance, institutions, water markets, some of the legal regulatory frameworks, and also in relation to how different segments of the society can use a land or water in the place they're in. And there's been other studies that already acknowledge this, looking at valuations and attributions that people have for glaciers. And me, I'm very much involved in this IBES, which is Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, where we acknowledge the way you understand about nature and any changes in nature based on also acknowledging diverse values. So we are trying to bring that kind of policy framework that is based on plural values typology to also climate change studies. So in some of you, if you're not aware of the typology, here the values are defined as meanings attached to nature, and societies value nature differently based on their worldviews, knowledge systems, and livelihoods. And often in policies, we see that only economic-based valuation gets into the decision making. So therefore, an economic calculation of losses are also the only ones that are recognized in this complexity. So in this project, we ask basically in what ways glacier melt can affect human-nature relations and these plural values. And we look at Scandinavia and the Himalaya with very exemplary, let's say, cases. So there's no argument that we are doing completely a meta study. And again, in social sciences, what we are interested in going deep rather than going broad. So these two study areas, okay, the second one we didn't present it here, is the glacier environments in Norway, and we look at also Ladakh and Uttarakhand. One of the reasons we choose especially Ladakh is that it is a place where communities live very close to glaciers. So these areas are not completely detached from societal life. And what we do is that we conduct interviews with communities in different livelihoods. We conduct focus groups. We try to co-produce design and questions of these interviews with local communities and researchers. So without going so much in detail, I just want to show some of the preliminary findings. So when we apply this plural value typology and ask, how do they experience the changes in glaciarized environments, but also what type of meanings they attach to these changes? Some argue that it can be an opportunity. They see an opportunity to apply more adaptation strategies. Maybe there will be more lands for animal grazing. And there are arguments that there can be new areas for extraction of resources. It could also be, for instance, plants. In Ladakh, of course, it's a bit more spiritual value that has been also attached to glaciers. Glaciers have been seen as gods or indicators of purity. This means glacier melt or retreat can be understood as something that's either gods are giving up of human societies or it's kind of a spiritual pollution. Glaciers, as you already know, is very much also a source of livelihoods, and this has been identified by the communities very widely. And we also find out that glacier retreat or glacier melt is also seen as loss of identity or feeling of sadnesses that has been explained in these interviews. And in any value typology, that what we are interested in is also the value conflicts. Often we also see that different groups emphasize one part of glacier related contribution higher than the other, and this could spark a conflict between different users of water. And this can be understood as any water conflict issue, but when it comes to in this very sensitive, fragile context, it can also spark a conflict. In Norway, though, we find also in different kind of approach, but still very similar. So glacier melt is seen as also opportunity for new areas for extraction, but also accessible routes for trekking and recreational activities if the glacier is melted. And some are also framed through a relational value, where we see glaciers as relation to childhood, their memories of childhood, nature, and crucial for sense of being, as also the nature in Norway has been very much related on snow and glaciarized landscapes. And here we see glaciers as water resource, mostly for electricity because of hydropower. And the glacier melt has been seen as a threat and a source of eco-anxiety, which was related, of course, then a bit different than a Ladakh case, where even though these emotions have been framed as sadness rather than anxiety. So and then we introduce this political ecology approach to understand these type of different values in relation to power. And I'm not going into this so much, but this approach makes us understand how also associated risks and benefits are being distributed and who gets to decide on such distribution, which we find it as also crucial for policymaking. There are enough studies, also my studies shows that different groups are impacted due to their situatedness in power structures. It's still more women that is, for instance, impacted in relation to water scarcity. They have to collect water in far away places. Or we also see these discussions of commodification of post-glacier spaces. So what happens to the land when it becomes available? Who uses it? and who has access to those areas. And often we also see like solar power parks wanted to be built in these kind of empty spaces, and that kind of discussions can also shape the way we understand what will happen in the future. There's findings on adaptation and loss. We also find in both cases that there is a difference between urban and rural informants' perceptions of glacier melt in relation to adaptation and resilience. Urban informants embrace more apocalyptic, basically more dramatic framings to climate change, and they want to have their action changed by individual actions. And as I said already, there's more eco-anxiety with urban informants than, for instance, rural informants who live much closer to glaciers, but they have a better understanding of these environments are already a bit wild environments. So they embrace a more resilient approach in relation to their emotions. As I said, Tibetan philosophy affects in certain parts in the way people attach meaning to glaciers, as glaciers are framed as living beings, moving ice, that requires time to maybe cope, adapt, and transform all the time. So change in some sort of a worldview is part of life, and that kind of also offers a different coping strategy in Ladakh, for instance. So some of our interviews shows that we feel sad to see how our glaciers are changing, but we have tools to cope with such emotions with meditation and community rituals. In a cabin owner in Norway also accepts that change is part of life when you live close to extreme environments. So there are different understanding of what this change means by different societies. Points of discussion that we try to bring with this research is that communities in these environments recognize multiple values and contribution of glaciers. There is a stark contrast between North and South. One can say that there is more cultural and recreational values that has been spelled out by the informants in Norway than, and the Ladakh case is more about people still mention about how their subsistence is depending on the water that comes from these glaciers. And there is widespread awareness among local communities of how these values are declining with climate change, and that most people are also thinking to maybe move from their villages. And there's expressed concern ranging from emotional impacts, as I said, feelings of sadness and frustration in the north comes also very much in relation to the proportional to the threats to the very ability to survive and exist. We also find out that some argue that we have to have proactive mitigation, such as climate change actions in relation to changes in consumption and Western lifestyles. And others talk about adaptation strategies, which is about livelihood diversification, water storage, moving, and sharing resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina. That was